In France, like America, the flying saucer mystery makes headlines. A young Frenchman photographed this flying saucer, or is it, from a mountainside in central France. Military officials, suspecting that the object was a meteorological balloon, send one aloft and photograph it. But comparison shows a striking contrast, and puzzled officials wonder, what was it? In Washington, ghost-like objects dart across the radar screen at the CAA Traffic Control Center at National Airport for several hours, traveling more than 100 miles an hour. Air Force jet fighters spend several hours chasing the objects plotted on the radar scope. General Sanford, Air Force Intelligence Director, confirms that the objects are not secret American weapons and reiterates the Air Force's obligation to investigate.
In pursuit of this obligation since 1947.
Chris Lado, welcome to Lado Files. Where did the UFO stigma come from? Just talking about UFOs or saying that you saw one or hearing about someone that researches UFOs inspires some sort of feeling, right? At least for me in the past, before a year and a half ago, really, when I started randomly researching UFOs, it was, I'm definitely not going to look into that. Okay, that's obviously crazy, something that I couldn't even imagine. And if someone's talking about that, they must be crazy, right? Ultimately. And this is where the face, you can kind of see here, this smiling face from the Robertson Panel saying, oh, yes, sir, you probably are crazy. Right? But that's not the truth, is it? Because after 80 years now, we still have people bringing these stories to light, right? They're still coming up. These stories are still happening. People are still seeing lights in the sky. And it turns out the stigma that we're talking about was actually created by none other than the Central Intelligence Agency. The CIA created the stigma through the Robertson Panel. So this video will go through the 1952 flap over Washington, D.C. We'll look into that. Really? Did you know the saucers, the aliens did visit the White House, apparently? Maybe they already did. Had the most sightings ever was in 1952 up until that year, and by far the most the Air Force would receive. So the DoD realized they had to do something. They started Project Blue Book. My last video was actually on Project Blue Book. They say the words literally, propaganda, use propaganda. They don't use those words, but basically they say use propaganda to convince the public that UFOs are not a thing and to discredit them. Let's get to the video. Thanks for being here. So 1952, Washington, D.C., the UFO Incident. Let's go through this. From July 12th to 29, 1952, a series of unidentified flying object sightings were reported in Washington, D.C. Later became known as the Washington Flap, the Washington National Airport sightings, or the invasion of Washington. So a flap, from my understanding, is that it's a smaller, maybe just a few days of sightings, where a wave is you have continuous sightings over maybe many months. Flaps are interesting too. This would tend to strengthen the extraterrestrial hypothesis, right? Because the idea is at certain times of the year, or maybe through periods of years, at certain points, we would be closer. So our Earth would be closer to some event or something. So maybe you would have ET visitors or ships passing through. Maybe it's some sort of point that they actually reference, or maybe they need to refuel. So they use some resource at Earth. They stop for water or something, refuel their water tanks. Who knows? But the flap, that's basically where it comes from. The most publicized sightings took place on consecutive weekends, July 19th to 20th and July 26th to 27th. Never before or after did Project Blue Book and the Air Force undergo such a tidal wave of UFO reports. So the Air Force was receiving reports up to 1952. Project Blue Book, again, I go through all those reports. They say nothing to see here, but they also had many unknowns, right? Many unknowns that they couldn't account for. And they had 12 sightings that they go through, which seemed very, very, extraterrestrial to me anyway. All right, events of the first weekend, July 19th to 20th, 1952 at 11:40 p.m. on Saturday. July 19th, 1952, Edward Nugent, an air traffic controller at Washington National Airport, today Ronald Reagan, Washington National Airport, spotted 7 objects on his radar. The objects were located 15 miles southwest of the city. No known aircraft were in the area, and the objects were not following any established flight paths. Nugent's superior, Harry Barnes, a senior air traffic controller at the airport, watched the objects on Nugent's radar scope. We knew immediately that a very strange situation existed. Their movements were completely radical compared to those of ordinary aircraft. Okay, so radar hits, okay? So one radar hit is not necessarily that powerful. You do get a lot of false radar hits off of weather. If there's ice in the clouds, it will return radar contacts. Okay, that's actually the excuse that the General Sanford says, that these were radar contacts, okay? But at this point, it's just one weird anomaly on this radar, okay? But he brings over other people. So Barnes had 2 controllers check Nugent's radar. They found it was working normally. Barnes then called National Airport's radar-equipped control tower. So this is to get another viewpoint. Okay, the controllers there, Howard Coughlin and Joe Zacco, said that they also had unidentified blips on their radar screen. And here's the key point, saw a hovering bright light in the sky, which departed with incredible speed. Coughlin asked Zacco, "Did you see that? What the hell was that?" So this is where it really gets real. So Barnes calls over to National Airport's radar-equipped control tower so that he knows they're in contact. Okay, they're always handing over traffic, etc. The controllers there say, yeah, we see this. We had unidentified blips on the radar screen. So that passes it as multiple radars. Okay, so if you do have some sort of anomaly in the air, right, it's only going to come back to that specific radar generally. Okay, I guess you could have solid ice building up in these clouds. Okay, that could be one thing. If they were seeing from multiple radars, you could get hits back from some ice in the clouds. That could be these objects, except they saw a hovering bright light in the sky, which departed with incredible speed. Okay, so if you also see a light there, then now you've confirmed it with radar and visual. So it's showing up in 2 different frequency spectrums, okay, from different systems. So that's multiple witnesses. At this point, other objects appeared in all sectors of the radar scope. So basically, they just all showed up. When they moved over the White House and the United States Capitol, Barnes called Andrews Air Force Base, located 10 miles from National Airport. So they see other objects appear on all sectors, and they moved over the White House and the U.S. Capitol. That's when Barnes called Andrews Air Force Base. So this is just his witness testimony. Okay, we don't have the radar tapes. I mean, we say, when are they going to show up and land on the White House lawn? It's like, maybe they already did. Although Andrews reported that they had no unusual objects on their radar, an airman soon called the base's control tower to report the sighting of a strange object. So it is interesting, Andrews base didn't see it. They had no objects on their radar, which is quite interesting, right? Airman William Brady, who was in the tower, then saw an object which appeared to be like an orange ball of fire, trailing a tail. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. As Brady tried to alert the other personnel in the tower, the strange object took off at an unbelievable speed. Okay, so maybe that was just this random young airman Brady, you know, the guy that always dies on the Star Trek episodes. Could it have been him not knowing what he was looking at? Maybe. Okay, but now there's more data, okay? On one of National Airport's runways, S.C. Pierman, a Capital Airlines pilot, was waiting in the cockpit of his DC-4 for permission to take off after spotting what he believed to be a meteor. He was told that the control tower's radar had detected unknown objects closing in on his position. Okay, so he thought he saw a meteor. Then the tower tells him, there's 6 unknown objects closing in on your position. Man, that would freak me out, like aliens or something. Pierman observed 6 objects, white, tailless, fast-moving lights over a 14-minute period. So here it kind of reminds me of the Starlink satellites, right? Except this was back in 1952, so no satellites. Pierman was in radio contact with Barnes during his sighting, and Barnes later related that each sighting coincided with a pip we could see near his plane. When he reported that the light streaked off at high speed, it disappeared on our scope. So that's amazing too, okay? You have visual observation. So they're communicating, the pilots and the controllers, and now they're saying that, hey, I see a light over here, and they coincide it with a blip on the radar. Meanwhile, at Andrews Air Force Base, the control tower personnel were tracking on radar what some thought to be unknown objects, but others suspected, and in one instance were able to prove, were simply stars and meteors. However, Staff Sergeant Charles Davenport observed an orange-red light to the south. The light would appear to stand still, then make an abrupt change in direction and altitude. This happened several times. At one point, both radar centers at National Airport and the radar at Andrews Air Force Base were tracking an object hovering over a radio beacon. The object vanished in all three radar centers at the same time. At 3 a.m., shortly before, two U.S. Air Force F-94 Starfire jet fighters from the Newcastle Air Force Base in Delaware arrived over Washington. So they did launch them. They got there at 3 a.m. All of the objects vanished from the radar at National Airport. However, when the jets ran low on fuel and left, the objects returned. So they returned, which convinced Barnes that the UFOs were monitoring radio traffic and behaving accordingly. The objects were last detected by radar at 5:30 a.m. So they were there all night, essentially. Publicity and the Air Force reaction. The sightings of July 1920-1952 made front-page headlines in newspapers around the nation. A typical example was the headlines from the Cedar Rapids Gazette in Iowa. It read, "Saucers swarm over Capitol" in large black type. So this could also be where the major UFO craziness came from, right? The flying saucers. Saucers swarm over Capitol in large black type. I mean, imagine seeing that in the newspaper. That'd be pretty interesting. By coincidence, USAF Captain Edward Ruppelt, the supervisor of the Air Force's Project Blue Book investigation into UFO sightings, was in Washington at the time. However, he did not learn about the sightings until Monday, July 21, when he read the headlines in a Washington area newspaper. So quite interesting here, when I went over Project Blue Book, they don't mention this flap 1952 or anything about Washington, D.C., or they just mentioned nothing in the report. But he was there. I mean, the guy looking into it. After talking with intelligence officers at the Pentagon about the sightings, Ruppelt spent several hours trying to obtain a staff car so he could travel around Washington to investigate the sighting, but was refused as only generals and senior colonels could use staff cars, of course, and we know how much work they're doing. He was told that he could rent a taxicab with his own money. By this point, Ruppelt was so frustrated that he left Washington and flew back to Blue Book's headquarters at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. Upon returning to Dayton, Ruppelt spoke with an Air Force radar specialist, Captain Roy James, who felt that unusual weather conditions could have caused the unknown radar targets. Listen to that. Events of July 26, 27. So this is the next weekend, the following weekend, at 8:15 p.m. on Saturday, July 26, 1952. It's a little earlier. A pilot and stewardess on a National Airlines flight into Washington observed some lights above their plane. Within minutes, both the radar centers at National Airport and the radar at Andrews Air Force Base were tracking more unknown objects. USAF Master Sergeant Charles E. Cummings visually observed the objects at Andrews. He later said that these lights did not have the characteristics of shooting stars. There was no trails. They traveled faster than any shooting star I've ever seen. Wow, listen to that. Okay, remember, this is before satellites. This is before Sputnik. This is before then. So what were they looking at? Meanwhile, Albert M. Chopp, the press spokesman for Project Blue Book, arrived at National Airport and, due to security concerns, denied several reporters' requests to photograph the radar screens. Damn it. Thanks a lot, Blue Book again. He then joined the radar center personnel. By this time, 9:30 p.m., the radar center was detecting unknown objects in every sector. At times, the objects traveled slowly. At other times, they reversed direction and moved across the radar scope at speeds calculated up to 7,000 miles per hour. At 11:30 p.m., two U.S. Air Force F-94 Starfire jet fighters from Newcastle Air Force Base in Delaware arrived over Washington. Captain John McCougo, the flight leader, was vectored towards the radar blips, but saw nothing despite repeated attempts. However, his wingman, Lieutenant William Patterson, did see 4 white glows and chased them. He told investigators that I tried to make contact with the bogies below 1,000 feet, and that I was at my maximum speed, but I ceased chasing them because I saw no chance of overtaking them. White glows. That kind of reminds me of the Gorman intercept, where basically he's following around in his P-51 Mustang, a white ball that he says is flying faster than supersonic, actually, and pulling more G's than a person could take. I make a video about that if you want to check it out. Interesting case. According to Albert Chopp, when ground control asked Patterson if he saw anything, Patterson replied, "I see them now, and they're all around me. What should I do?" And nobody answered because we didn't know what to tell him. I'll listen to that. Okay, so that wasn't in Project Blue Book. You know, when I read through it, didn't say, yes, and there was this case in Washington where basically this guy says, I see them now and they're all around me. What should I do? These are fighter pilots. All right, after midnight on July 27th, so the next, just a few hours later, USAF Major Dewey Fournette, Project Blue Book's liaison at the Pentagon, and Lieutenant John Holcomb, a United States Navy radar specialist, arrived at the radar center at National Airport. So they're there. Okay, this is it. Project Blue Book, you're the guys. During the night, Lieutenant Holcomb received a call from Washington National Weather Station. They told him that a slight temperature inversion was present over the city. Yeah, slight temperature inversion. But Holcomb felt that the inversion was not nearly strong enough to explain the good and solid returns on the radar scopes. This ends up being kind of the main argument the Air Force says. Major General Sanford says it was weird weather inversion. So weather inversion caused the lights to be reflected. The lights to be reflected off the ground, okay? Which I guess is possible, but then it never repeats. This never repeats again. They don't see any more crazy radar returns, multiple radar returns. I mean, the argument just seems ridiculous, right? Fournette relayed that all those present in the radar room were convinced that the targets were most likely caused by solid metallic objects. There had been weather targets on the scope too, he said, but this was a common occurrence, and the controllers were paying no attention to them. 2 more F-94s from Newcastle Air Force Base were scrambled during the night. One pilot saw nothing unusual. The other pilot saw a white light which vanished when he moved towards it. Civilian aircraft also reported glowing objects that corresponded to radar blips seen by Andrews radar operators. As on July 20, the sightings and unknown radar returns ended at sunrise. Okay, so that's basically the major flap. That was the flap. A lot of radar hits, tons of radar hits from multiple facilities, people seeing them, calling them in, and corroborating them to the actual sightings. So the radar blips to the sightings when they launched the fighters. Basically, the fighters saw these white balls of light, these white lights, flying all around them, didn't know what they were, so it must be a weird weather phenomenon. Air Force explanation. Air Force Major General John Sanford, U.S. Director of Intelligence, and Roger Ramey, USAF Director of Operations, held a well-attended press conference at the Pentagon July 29, 1952. Okay, this is only 2 days later. That was that famous briefing, you know.
However, there have been a certain percentage of this volume of reports that have been made by credible observers of relatively incredible things. It is this group of observations that we now are attempting to resolve. Our basic difficulty in dealing with these is that there is no measurement of them that makes it possible for us to put them in any pattern that would be profitable for a deliberate, custom sort of analysis to take the next step. We have, as of date, come to only one firm conclusion with respect to this remaining percentage, and that is that it does not contain any pattern of purpose or of consistency that we can relate with any conceivable threat to the United States.
At the event, Sanford stated that the visual sightings over Washington could be explained as misidentified aerial phenomena such as stars or meteors, and unknown radar targets could be explained by temperature inversion, which was present in the air over Washington on both nights the radar returns were reported. In addition, Sanford stated that the unknown radar contacts were not caused by solid material objects, not solid or material, and therefore posed no threat to national security. In response to a question as to whether the Air Force had recorded similar UFO radar contacts prior to the incident, Sanford said that there had been hundreds of such contacts where Air Force fighter interceptions had taken place, but stated they were all fruitless. It was the largest Pentagon press conference since World War II. Press stories called Sanford and Ramey the Air Force's 2 top UFO experts. But this is where the stigma comes from, okay? Let's see how this happens. Watch this. White House concern and CIA interest. So the White House, were they just sleeping in there with all these lights overhead? The sightings of July 26-27 also made front page headlines and led President Harry Truman to have his Air Force aide call Ruppelt and ask for an explanation of the sightings and unknown radar returns. Pretty interesting. Truman listened to the conversation between the two men on a separate phone but did not ask questions himself. Ruppelt, remembering the conversation he had with Captain James, told the president's assistant that the sightings might have been caused by a temperature inversion, in which a layer of warm, moist air covers a layer of cool, dry air closer to the ground. This condition can cause radar signals to bend and give false returns. However, Ruppelt had not yet interviewed any of the witnesses or conducted a formal investigation. So before he does really anything, he wasn't able to go and actually investigate anything. This is what he comes up with. He heard there was a possibility for a temperature inversion. And that's the answer you get. CIA historian Gerald Haynes, in his 1997 history of the CIA's involvement with UFOs, also mentions Truman's concern. A massive buildup of sightings over the United States in 1952, especially in July, alarmed the Truman administration. On 19 and 20 July, radar scopes at Washington National Airport and Andrews Air Force Base tracked mysterious blips. On 27 July, the blips reappeared. What they don't mention is all the people that also said they saw lights. And they launched the fighters. They also saw the white lights that would disappear when they approached. The CIA would react to the 1952 wave of UFO reports by forming a special study group within the Office of Scientific Intelligence and Office of Current Intelligence to review the situation. Edward Taus reported for the group that most UFO sightings could be easily explained. Yeah, most can be easily explained, yes. It's true. Nonetheless, he recommended that the agency continue monitoring the problem. Right, so just most, but we don't care. There's nothing to see there. The CIA's concern with the issue would lead to the creation in January 1953 of the Robertson Panel. The extremely high numbers of UFO reports in 1952 disturbed both the Air Force and the CIA. Both groups felt that an enemy nation could deliberately flood the U.S. with false UFO reports, causing mass panic and allowing them to launch a sneak attack. On September 24, 1952, the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence sent a memorandum to Walter B. Smith, the CIA's director. The memo stated that the flying saucer situation has national security implications. In the public concern with the phenomena lies the potential for the touching off of mass hysteria and panic. The result of this memorandum was the creation in January 1953 of the Robertson Panel. Dr. Howard P. Robertson, a physicist, chaired the panel, which consisted of prominent scientists and which spent 4 days examining the best UFO cases collected by Project Blue Book. 4 whole days. The panel dismissed nearly all of the UFO cases it examined as not representing anything unusual or threatening to national security. Okay, which is it? So if it's not threatening to national security, but it's unusual, was it listed in there? In the panel's controversial estimate, the Air Force and Project Blue Book needed to spend less time analyzing and studying UFO reports and more time publicly debunking them, proving them incorrect, proving that there's nothing to see here, that there's no effect, in order to lower the temperature, right? And not allow an enemy such as Russia to take advantage of this crazy hype. Plus, they're receiving a lot of reports. They're getting a lot of calls of these things. It's causing them to answer the phone a lot and go and look at stuff. The panel recommended that the Air Force and Project Blue Book should take steps to strip the unidentified flying objects of the special status they have been given and the aura of mystery they have unfortunately acquired. Following the panel's recommendation, Project Blue Book would rarely publicize any UFO case that it had not labeled as solved. Unsolved cases were rarely mentioned by the Air Force. And I think this is why we're not getting any information, because they're only going to release solved cases, and it looks like they're not very good at actually solving the cases to get us more information. The CIA analysts were broadly skeptical concerning the possibility that some UFO reports may represent extraterrestrial objects or objects of terrestrial, either American or Russian manufacture, favoring the hypothesis that currently unidentified reports were misidentifications of conventional objects or natural phenomena. In an internal CIA paper dated 19 August 1952, the analyst notes, in summarizing this discussion, I would restate that on 3 of the main theories and explanation of these phenomena, a U.S. development, a Russian development, and spaceships, the evidence of either a fact or of logic is so strongly against them that they warrant at present no more than speculative consideration. However, it is important that there are many who believe in them and will continue to do so in spite of any official pronouncement which may be made. This whole affair has demonstrated that there is a fair proportion of our population which is mentally conditioned to acceptance of the incredible. Thus, we arrive at 2 danger points which, in a situation of international tension, seem to have national security implications. So you have to remember, this is back in 1952. They just finished a terrible, terrible world war. Okay, world war, nuclear weapons. You have all these crazy new technologies. Finally, we're back in some semblance of peace, and now the Russians are spinning up their program, their space program, etc. So you can imagine what's going on here. At least the mentality. And you can see right here, they're not interested in getting to the truth. As they say, the evidence, either of fact or of logic, is so strongly against them that they warrant at present no more than a speculative consideration. Okay, and I would say they're not even doing any sort of speculative consideration, considering that it's not even possible that any of this could happen. So they started the stigma. They started it at that point. These twin concerns, potential for psychological warfare and overloading of air defense systems, were formalized in a memorandum to the Director of Central Intelligence, General Walter Smith, on September 11th, 1952. Look at that. They did say the study makes no attempt to solve the more fundamental aspect of the problem, which is to determine definitely the nature of the various phenomena which are causing these sightings, or to discover means by which these causes and their visual and electronic effects may be immediately identified. Our consultant panel stated that these solutions would probably be found on the margins or just beyond the frontiers of our present phenomena. So they still don't know what it is, but they say, we could just find out. It's just, we're so close. The memorandum went on to make the following recommendations. Okay, the first, the Director of Central Intelligence advises the National Security Council of the security implications inherent in the flying saucer problem, with the request that, the CIA, Director of Central Intelligence, be empowered to institute through the appropriate agencies, either within or without the government, the investigation and research necessary to solve the problem of instant positive identification of unidentified flying objects. So right here, they ask, we want more power. Okay, why? Because it's a national security problem. National security implications in the flying saucer problem, okay? So we're going to give the CIA is asking for empowerment to institute through the appropriate agencies, either within or without the government, so not even in the government, the investigation and research necessary to solve the problem of instant positive identification of unidentified flying objects. So this could be just the creation of Men in Black right here, right? This could have been requesting more authority. The CIA, under its assigned responsibilities and in cooperation with the Psychological Strategy Board, immediately investigate possible offensive or defensive utilization of the phenomena for psychological warfare purposes both for and against the United States, advising those agencies charged with the U.S. internal security of any pertinent findings affecting their areas of responsibility. So there's nothing to see here. Most of these, all of them probably, are mundane, but we want to just see if there's any offensive or defensive utilization of the phenomena in general that we can use for psychological warfare purposes, both for and against the United States. So we want to use it as a weapon against our enemies and to protect us, right? Any sort of psychological warfare that we can do, or strategy, right? The CIA, we should give them this ability, right? Yeah, go ahead. Cooperate with the Psychological Strategy Board. What could possibly happen? On the basis of these programs of research, CIA develop and recommend for adoption by the National Security Council a policy of public information which will minimize the risk of panic. So here we go. This could easily be your Men in Black program created right here. Okay, so let's look at it. This is what the CIA requested from the Robertson Panel. Okay, that the Director of Central Intelligence be empowered to institute through the appropriate agencies, whatever agency that they want, either within or without the government. So you can make your own agency outside of the government. The investigation and research necessary to solve the problem of instant positive identification of unidentified flying objects. So we can't identify them right away, but empower us, the CIA. Nothing bad will happen, I'm sure. Then the CIA, even though there's nothing bad here to happen, but we want to work to see if there's any psychological offensive or defensive weapons we can come up with. I mean, it makes sense. That's what they're supposed to do. But then finally, based on these, on the basis of these programs of research, so these programs of research continuing, CIA develop and recommend for adoption by the National Security Council a policy of public information which will minimize the risk of panic. What is this going to be? Risk of panic. Nothing to see here. All of these, many of these sightings can be explained away as mundane items, and there's really no reason to look into this any further, except for psychological offensive defense capabilities, or to have our secret organizations empowered through the CIA to investigate and research the problem of instant positive identification of unidentified flying objects. So that is probably where the actual stigma actually came from. from the CIA, saying to the National Security Council, we're going to institute a program. Can we have the authority? Nothing bad will happen from this. So the actual Robertson Panel formally met January 14th, 1953, under the direction of this guy, Howard P. Robertson. He was a physicist, a CIA consultant, and director of the Defense Department Weapons Evaluation Group. There were other people on there. Luis Alvarez, a physicist, radar expert, later Nobel Prize recipient. Frederick Durant. He wrote the Durant Report, which is where most of this information comes from. Basically just his notes, right? They didn't even have anything better than just his notes. CIA officer, secretary to the panel, and missile expert. You had Goudsmit, nuclear physicist. Thornton Page, astrophysicist, radar expert, deputy director. Lloyd Berkner, a physicist, and J. Allen Hynek. He wasn't a full member, but he was there. He actually did one of the briefs. According to Thornton Page, there was an informal meeting prior to the main panel meetings with no outsiders. At this meeting, H.P. Robertson told us in the first private, no outsiders session, that our job was to reduce public concern and show that UFO reports could be explained by conventional reasoning. So the CIA has already said that they want to minimize public exposure because of the national security threat, and they want to make sure there can be no psychological operations run against us, but we want to find out if we can use it as a weapon as well. And now this guy, CIA, basically Agent Robertson, is running the Robertson Panel. He basically ran it. They had formal meetings, 4 days they really worked hard over those 4 days to really nail down this. They looked at 23 cases, about 1%, although Ruppelt wrote that the panel studied their best cases. We've seen 12 in the Blue Book. That's all the ones I've seen. They seem pretty interesting. On the first day, they've viewed 2 motion pictures of UFOs, the Mariana UFO footage and the 1952 Utah UFO film. So they were crushing it on the first day. They looked at 2 videos, just blowing it away. I mean, it's amazing they didn't lock it down exactly and find out what happened. On the second day, Ruppelt finished his presentation. Hynek discussed the Pathé study, and the panel discussed with Air Force personnel the problems inherent in monitoring UFO sightings. So they talked about how hard it is to get sightings, basically. They said the Utah one was probably birds. And then on the third day, this is probably the most interesting part for me, Air Force Major Dewey Fournette spoke to the panel. For over a year, he coordinated UFO affairs for the Pentagon. So it's like Nick Pope. Over a year, he coordinated UFO affairs for the Pentagon. Fournette supported the extraterrestrial hypothesis as the best explanation for some puzzling UFO reports. So the one guy who'd done the most study besides from, the other guy, the one guy from the Air Force who coordinated UFO affairs for the Pentagon did say that he thought it was UFO, that it was extraterrestrials. So the conclusions. Here we go. Durant recorded this. The panel concluded unanimously that there was no evidence of a direct threat to national security in the objects cited. That was step 1. Is there a national security threat? No, sir. They did not find any evidence that related the objects cited to space travelers. Mr. Fournette, in his presentation, showed how he had eliminated each of the known and probable causes of sightings, leaving him extraterrestrial as the only one remaining in many cases. Fournette's background as an aeronautical engineer and technical intelligence officer, project officer, Blue Book for 15 months, could not be slighted. However, the panel could not accept any of the cases cited by him because they were raw, unevaluated reports. Terrestrial explanations of the sightings were suggested in some cases, and in others the time of sighting was so short as to cause suspicion of visual impressions. So the one guy there who has the most experience probably, apart from Hynek investigating UFO reports, Hynek was on Blue Book, but Fournette, 15 months as a project officer on Blue Book and a year managing the Pentagon's UFO affairs, says that they were extraterrestrial because he could not account for any other explanation. But they just say, it doesn't matter. Why? Because those are raw, unevaluated reports, right? Those are unevaluated reports. What about the evaluated reports? We don't look at those because those are just too short visual impressions. So the formal recommendations, right? Mainly on the educational or debunking aspects of their conclusions. So pursuant to the request, the panel has received the evidence as presented and reviewed everything. As a result of its considerations, the panel concludes that the evidence presented on UFOs shows no indication that the phenomena constitute a direct physical threat to national security. Step 1. We firmly believe there's no residuum of cases which indicates phenomena which are attributable to foreign artifacts capable of hostile acts. and that there is no evidence that the phenomena indicates a need for the revision of current scientific concepts. And they found this. The panel further concludes that the continued emphasis on the reporting of these phenomena does, in these parlous times, result in a threat to the orderly functioning of the protective organs of the body politic. Look at that. The nation, the reports, if we have a real attack, we'll be clogged by all these fake UFO reports that are coming up just because of mass hysteria. We need to just lower the mass hysteria and then everything will be fine. Never mind, 80 years later, we see the same things. And we've seen the same things year in, year out since then. And the national security agencies take immediate steps to strip the unidentified flying objects of the special status they have been given and the aura of mystery they have unfortunately acquired. The national security agencies institute policies on intelligence, training, and public education designed to prepare the material defenses and the moral of the country to recognize most promptly and to react most effectively to true indications of hostile intent or action. So based on this, after CIA recommends that they don't look into it, they lower the actual temperature out there. Meanwhile, give the CIA whatever agencies it needs to actually research and investigate the true phenomena. Okay, you just saw there, the CIA was directed. CIA officials said no further consideration of the subject appeared warranted, although they continued to monitor sightings in the interests of national security. Philip Strong and Fred Durant from OSI also briefed the Office of National Estimates on the findings. CIA officials wanted knowledge of any agency interest in the subject of flying saucers carefully restricted, noting not only that the Robertson Panel report was classified, but also that any mention of CIA sponsorship of the panel was forbidden. So, forbidden to know that the Robertson Panel was headed by a CIA agent who effectively worked for the CIA, and that the CIA already went in with the knowledge that they wanted to decrease the temperature. The one person with the most experience on the whole board, which was Fournette, in actually researching UFOs, said it was probably extraterrestrial. That's the only way he could think of it. There's nothing else left. And they said, let's not listen to that guy. Let's write what we want. And that's what they did. So that was the Robertson Panel. And the stigma was started from there. You see, directed by a panel headed by the CIA to reduce the hype, the special status that UFOs hold. And so it went from special status to, if you talk about UFOs, you are crazy and not someone worth talking to. Your credibility will be ruined. Hit that like button if you did like this content, and then subscribe for future notifications. You can support the channel at patreon.com/Chris Lato, and you will get extra videos. I uploaded an hour of extra videos last week. That's exclusive content. A little too juicy for YouTube. I can throw it up on my Patreon. So if you want exclusive videos on UFOs and additional content, then go to patreon.com/Chris Lato. It's $5 a month. You get no ads on all videos and exclusive content. So I'm doubling down on Patreon. See you guys over there. Peace.